Dr. Lisa Chen had always been different from other women her age. While her friends were getting married and having babies, she was working 16-hour shifts at Riverside General Hospital. At 45, she had devoted her entire life to medicine. Her apartment was neat and quiet, filled with medical journals instead of family photos. She liked it that way, or at least that's what she told herself. The small town of Cedar Falls wasn't the kind of place where big things happened. Most people knew each other, and the biggest excitement was usually the annual Harvest Festival. Dr. Chen had moved there 5 years ago because the hospital needed an emergency room doctor, and she needed a fresh start after a difficult divorce. The pace was slower than the city hospitals where she used to work, but she found peace in the routine. That peace was shattered on a cold Tuesday night in March. Dr. Chen was finishing up her shift when the ambulance sirens pierced through the quiet evening. She could hear the urgency in the sound, different from the usual calls they got for minor injuries or elderly patients having breathing problems. This was the kind of siren that made her heart race, even after 20 years in emergency medicine. The paramedics rushed through the doors carrying a small boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His clothes were torn and covered in soot, his face streaked with tears and smoke stains. The smell of fire clung to him like a terrible perfume. Dr. Chen's training kicked in immediately as she took in his condition: burns on his arms, smoke in his lungs, and eyes wide with terror and confusion. "House fire on Maple Street," one of the paramedics said quickly as they transferred the boy to a hospital bed. "We lost the grandmother. This is the only survivor we found." Dr. Chen felt her chest tighten. She had seen many tragic cases over the years, but there was something about this small boy that hit her differently. Maybe it was the way he looked so lost and alone, or maybe it was because she knew exactly what it felt like to have no one. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked gently as she began examining him. The boy looked up at her with big brown eyes filled with fear and pain, but he didn't answer. She could see he was in shock, which was completely normal for someone who had just lived through such a terrifying experience. For the next 3 hours, Dr. Chen worked on treating his injuries. The burns weren't as serious as they could have been, thanks to the quick response of the fire department. The smoke inhalation was more concerning, but his young lungs were strong. As she cleaned his wounds and made sure he could breathe properly, she found herself talking to him in a soft voice, telling him he was safe now and that she wasn't going to let anything bad happen to him. The boy, whose name she learned was David, gradually began to respond to her gentle care. He told her in whispered words about his grandmother, how they were watching television when they smelled smoke. He described how his grandmother had pushed him out of the window before the flames got too bad, but she couldn't get out herself. The pain in his voice when he talked about losing the only family he had left made Dr. Chen's eyes water. As the night went on, social workers arrived to figure out what would happen to David. Dr. Chen learned that his parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and his grandmother had been his only remaining family. He would need to be placed in foster care, but finding a suitable home in Cedar Falls wasn't going to be easy. The town was small and mostly white, and many families weren't prepared to take in a child, especially one dealing with such recent trauma. Dr. Chen overheard the social workers discussing their options on the phone, and none of them sounded promising. The nearest specialized foster families were hours away in the city, which would mean David would have to leave everything familiar behind once again. Something inside Dr. Chen's chest began to ache as she watched David sleep fitfully in the hospital bed. She had always told herself she wasn't the mothering type. Her career had been everything to her, and she had convinced herself that she was too set in her ways to change her life for anyone else. But looking at this brave little boy who had lost everything, she felt something she had never experienced before. The next morning, David was physically stable enough to be discharged, but there was still nowhere for him to go. The social worker, a kind woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, was making phone call after phone call trying to find a temporary placement. Dr. Chen found herself stopping by David's room more often than necessary, bringing him juice boxes and crackers from the nurse's station. "Are you going to be my new doctor?" David asked during one of her visits. His voice was still hoarse from the smoke, but he seemed less frightened than the night before. "I hope so," Dr. Chen replied, surprised by how much she meant it. I want to make sure you get better completely. David nodded seriously. My grandma always said doctors were like angels who help people feel better. She said I should always trust doctors because they have good hearts. Those simple words hit Dr. Chen harder than any medical emergency she had ever faced. She excused herself and walked quickly to the hospital chapel, a small, quiet room where she sometimes went to think. During difficult cases, sitting in the back pew, she tried to understand what was happening to her. She had built her entire life around being independent and self-sufficient. She worked long hours, came home to her quiet apartment, and repeated the cycle day after day. It was predictable and safe, but suddenly it also seemed terribly lonely. The thought of David being sent away to strangers in the city, away from the only place he had left that held memories of his grandmother, made her feel sick to her stomach. Before she could change her mind, Dr. Chen found herself walking to the social services office. Mrs. Rodriguez looked surprised to see her, but welcomed her into the small conference room where they had been trying to coordinate David's placement. I want to apply to be David's foster parent, Dr. Chen said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. The room went quiet. Mrs. Rodriguez blinked several times as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. The other staff members exchanged glances that Dr. Chen couldn't quite read. Dr. Chen, that's very generous of you, Mrs. Rodriguez finally said carefully. But are you sure you've thought this through? Fostering a child, especially one who has experienced such trauma, is a huge commitment. And you work such long hours at the hospital. Dr. Chen felt her determination growing stronger with each concern they raised. I can adjust my schedule. I have savings that would allow me to cut back on my hours. And as a doctor, I'm probably better equipped than most people to help David deal with his physical and emotional recovery. She paused, realizing that everything she was saying was true, but also that there was something much deeper driving her decision. That little boy has lost everyone he loved. He shouldn't have to lose his hometown too. And maybe we both need each other more than either of us realized. The first night David came home with Dr. Chen was nothing like either of them had imagined. She had spent the afternoon rushing around her quiet apartment, trying to turn her spare room into something that looked like a kid's bedroom. She bought a bed, some basic furniture, and stood in the toy aisle at the local store, feeling completely lost. What did 8-year-old boys like? She ended up grabbing a few books, some building blocks, and art supplies, hoping she was getting something right. David walked through her apartment slowly, carrying a small bag with the few belongings the fire department had managed to save from his grandmother's house. Dr. Chen watched him take in everything, the medical journals stacked on tables, the walls covered with her diplomas and certificates, the kitchen that clearly belonged to someone who ate most of their meals at work. It was obvious that this was not a home designed for children. Is this where I'm going to live now? David asked quietly, his voice still rough from the smoke damage to his throat. For now, yes, Dr. Chen replied, suddenly feeling nervous in her own home. We can change things around however you want. Make it more comfortable for you. David nodded and didn't say much else. That night she heard him crying softly through the thin walls and her heart broke all over again. She wanted to go comfort him but wasn't sure if that would make things better or worse. She had no idea what she was doing. The next few weeks were a series of small disasters and tiny victories. Dr. Chen quickly learned that 8-year-old boys needed to eat much more often than she did, and that they couldn't survive on coffee and hospital cafeteria food. She found herself leaving work early to pick David up from school, something she had never done for anyone in her entire career. The school pickup was its own challenge. Cedar Falls Elementary was small, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Dr. Chen could feel the stares and hear the whispered conversations when she arrived to collect David. Some parents smiled politely but kept their distance. Others were more direct with their curiosity. So you're the doctor who took in the boy from the fire, Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter was in David's class, said one afternoon. Her tone wasn't mean, but it wasn't exactly warm either. That's very nice of you. Must be quite an adjustment. Dr. Chen just smiled and nodded, but she could read between the lines. The unspoken questions hung in the air. Why would a single white woman take in a black child? Was she really prepared for this? How long would it last? David felt the stares too. Dr. Chen could see it in the way his shoulders tensed when they walked through the grocery store together, or how he went quiet when other kids at school asked him questions about his new mom. He never complained, but she could tell he was trying to figure out where he belonged in this small town where he already looked different from most people, and now his family situation was different too. The hardest part was the nightmares. Almost every night for the first month, David would wake up screaming. Dr. Chen would rush to his room to find him sitting up in bed, his pajamas soaked with sweat, calling out for his grandmother. She would sit with him until he fell back asleep, sometimes reading to him from the medical journals on her nightstand because they were the only books she had in the house. "Those are boring stories," David said one night after she had finished reading an article about emergency room procedures. "They are pretty boring," Dr. Chen agreed with a small smile. "Tomorrow we'll go to the library and get some better books." "Can we get books about doctors?" David asked. "I want to know what you do at work." That was the first time Dr. Chen realized that David wasn't just living with her. He was watching her and trying to understand her world. The next day, they spent 2 hours at the Cedar Falls Library, and David picked out picture books about hospitals, doctors, and how the human body works. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, raised her eyebrows but helped them find everything David wanted. As the weeks turned into months, they began to develop their own routines. Dr. Chen taught herself to cook simple meals that David actually wanted to eat. David started helping her organize her medical supplies at home, carefully sorting bandages and reading the labels on medication bottles. He was surprisingly good at it, and Dr. Chen found herself explaining basic medical concepts to him as they worked together. "Why do people's hearts stop beating?" David asked one evening as he handed her a stethoscope to put away. Dr. Chen paused, thinking about how to explain something so complex to a child. "Hearts are like engines in cars," she said finally. "Sometimes they get tired, sometimes they get sick, and sometimes they just wear out. That's why doctors try to help keep them healthy and strong." David nodded seriously. "Is that why my grandma's heart stopped? Because it got tired?" The question hit Dr. Chen like a punch to the stomach. She had been so focused on David's physical recovery from the fire that she hadn't fully addressed his grief and confusion about losing his grandmother. She sat down next to him on the living room floor where they had been working. "Your grandma's heart stopped because there was too much smoke in the air," she explained gently. "It wasn't because she was tired or sick. It was because of the fire, and that wasn't her fault or your fault. She loved you very much and she made sure you were safe before anything else." David was quiet for a long time, playing with the medical tape dispenser. "I miss her," he finally whispered. "I know you do," Dr. Chen said, putting her arm around his small shoulders. "It's okay to miss her. She was very important to you." "Will you miss me if something happens to you?" David asked, looking up at her with those big brown eyes that seemed too serious for his age. Dr. Chen felt tears spring to her eyes. "David, nothing is going to happen to me. And yes, I would miss you terribly if something happened. You're very important to me, too." That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. David began opening up more about his memories of his grandmother and his parents. Dr. Chen found herself sharing stories about her own childhood and why she had become a doctor. They started cooking together on weekends, with David helping her follow recipes that his grandmother had taught him. The town slowly began to adjust to seeing them together. Mr. Williams at the hardware store started saving interesting medical supplies catalogs for David to look at. The school principal, Mrs. Thompson, made a point of telling Dr. Chen that David was doing well in class and seemed to be adjusting better than anyone had expected. But the real breakthrough came 6 months after David moved in, during a busy Saturday at the hospital. Dr. Chen had to work an emergency shift, and her usual babysitter was sick. She had no choice but to bring David with her, settling him in the break room with homework and books. An hour into her shift, a construction worker was brought in with a severe cut on his hand. As Dr. Chen worked to clean and stitch the wound, she realized David had quietly appeared in the doorway, watching intently. Instead of sending him away, she found herself explaining what she was doing. "The needle helps pull the skin back together," she told David as she worked. like sewing but on a person instead of fabric. The construction worker, despite his pain, seemed charmed by David's serious attention. "You training your son to be a doctor?" he asked Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen glanced at David, who beamed with pride at being called her son. "Maybe," she said, surprising herself with how natural the word sounded. He's certainly got the attention span for it. That night as they drove home together, David was unusually talkative about what he had seen at the hospital. "I want to learn how to help people like you do," he said. Dr. Chen looked at him in the rearview mirror and realized that somewhere along the way, without either of them really noticing, they had become a real family. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but they belonged together now. The scared, lonely woman and the traumatized little boy had found exactly what they needed in each other. By the time David turned 17, he had grown into a young man that Dr. Chen barely recognized from the frightened 8-year-old she had first met in the emergency room. He was tall now, almost 6 feet, with his grandmother's warm smile and a sharp mind that impressed everyone who met him. He had become the star of the school's debate team and maintained perfect grades while volunteering at the hospital every weekend. The years had been good to both of them. Dr. Chen had learned to balance her demanding career with being a mother, though she still worked long hours. David had not only recovered from his trauma, but had channeled his experiences into a deep desire to help others. Their home was now filled with David's awards, science fair trophies, and college brochures from some of the best universities in the country. Cedar Falls had changed too. The small town that once whispered about the unusual family had embraced them completely. David was well liked at school, and Dr. Chen had become one of the most respected members of the community. Their story had become a source of pride for the town, proof that good things could happen in small places. But all of that was about to change in ways none of them could have predicted. The first sign of trouble came on a cold Monday morning in November. Dr. Chen was having coffee in the hospital break room when Dr. Martinez, the hospital administrator, walked in with a grim expression on his face. She had known him for years and could tell immediately that something serious was wrong. "Lisa, we need to talk," he said, sitting down heavily in the chair across from her. "I just got off the phone with the corporate office. Morrison Industries is shutting down their plant here, all of it. They're moving operations to Mexico." Dr. Chen felt her stomach drop. Morrison Industries was the biggest employer in Cedar Falls, providing jobs for nearly 2,000 people. The plant made automotive parts and had been the backbone of the local economy for over 30 years. Half the town worked there directly, and most of the local businesses depended on those workers as customers. "When?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "They're announcing it publicly tomorrow, but the shutdown starts immediately. No warning to the workers, no severance packages, just pink slips and 30 days to clear out." The news hit Cedar Falls like a bomb going off. By Tuesday afternoon, the main street looked like a ghost town. The diner where Dr. Chen and David often ate dinner was nearly empty. The hardware store had a going out of business sign in the window. Families were already packing up to move away, looking for work in bigger cities where jobs might still exist. The impact on the hospital was immediate and devastating. Within a week, Dr. Chen was treating people who couldn't afford their medications anymore. Parents brought in children with minor injuries they normally would have handled at home, hoping the hospital wouldn't charge them if the problem wasn't serious. The stress of sudden unemployment was causing heart problems, depression, and anxiety attacks in people who had never had health issues before. Even worse, many families simply stopped coming to the hospital at all because they couldn't pay. Dr. Chen knew there were people suffering at home rather than seeking medical care they desperately needed. The situation was breaking her heart, but there wasn't much she could do about it. The hospital itself was in serious financial trouble. With so many people uninsured or unable to pay their bills, the revenue dropped by 60% almost overnight. Dr. Martinez called staff meetings every few days to deliver more bad news. First, they had to cut the nursing staff. Then they eliminated the weekend emergency coverage. Finally, he gathered everyone together to announce that they might have to close the hospital entirely. "I'm sorry," Dr. Martinez said, looking around. The room at the doctors and nurses who had dedicated their careers to serving Cedar Falls. "The numbers just don't work anymore. Corporate is talking about shutting us down, eh? And selling the building. There's talk of patients having to drive 40 miles to Riverside General for emergency care. Dr. Chen couldn't believe what she was hearing. Cedar Falls without a hospital would be like a body without a heart. The elderly. Residents wouldn't survive the long drive to the next nearest medical facility. Young families would have to move away rather than risk living so far from emergency care. The town would truly die without medical services. That night, she came home to find David at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, notebooks, and his laptop computer. This had become his usual position lately. He spent most of his free time researching and writing, though he was secretive about what exactly he was working on. College applications? Dr. Chen asked. Though she knew the deadlines had passed months ago, David had already been accepted to several excellent universities and had his pick of pre-med programs. Something like that, David replied without looking up from his screen. He had been giving her vague answers like this for weeks, and she was starting to worry that he was stressed about leaving home for college. David, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? Dr. Chen sat down across from him at the table. If you're worried about the cost of college, or about leaving Cedar Falls with everything that's happening. David finally looked up at her, and she was surprised to see that his eyes were bright with excitement rather than worry. Mom, what if I told you I think I have an idea that could help? Not just help us, but help the whole town? Dr. Chen raised her eyebrows. David had always been smart and creative, but he was still just 17 years old. What kind of idea? I need a few more days to finish my research, David said, closing his laptop carefully. But I think there might be a way to save the hospital and bring jobs back to Cedar Falls at the same time. It's complicated, and it would require a lot of people working together, but I think it could work. Before Dr. Chen could ask more questions, David gathered up his papers and headed to his room. She sat alone in the kitchen, wondering what her son could possibly be planning. She knew he was brilliant. His teachers had been telling her that for years, but the problems facing Cedar Falls seemed too big for anyone to solve, let alone a teenager. Over the next few days, Dr. Chen watched. The town continued to deteriorate. The grocery store reduced its hours because they didn't have enough customers. The school district announced they would have to combine classes and lay off teachers. Even the post office was talking about cutting back to 3 days a week. Meanwhile, David became even more focused on his mysterious project. She would find him on phone calls at odd hours, speaking quietly to people she didn't recognize. Packages started arriving for him, thick envelopes from government offices and universities. He had filled several notebooks with charts, graphs, and lists that he kept carefully organized in a special folder. David, you're starting to worry me, Dr. Chen said one evening after finding him still awake at midnight, typing furiously on his laptop. Whatever you're working on, it's taking over your life. You need to sleep and you need to tell me what's going on. David saved his work and turned to face her. The expression on his face was more serious than she had ever seen it. Mom, do you remember when you first brought me home from the hospital and you told me that doctors help people when they need it most? Of course I remember. And do you remember teaching me that sometimes the best solutions come from seeing problems differently than everyone else? Dr. Chen nodded, though she wasn't sure where this conversation was heading. David took a deep breath. I think I know how to save Cedar Falls, but I'm going to need your help and I'm going to need you to trust me even though what I'm suggesting might sound crazy at first. He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. I've been working on this for 2 months. I think I've figured out how to turn our biggest problem into our biggest opportunity. Dr. Chen looked at the screen, trying to make sense of the detailed charts and documents David had prepared. What she saw there would change everything she thought she knew about her son's capabilities, and everything she thought she knew about what was possible for their small town. Dr. Chen stared at David's laptop screen, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The documents were incredibly detailed. Charts showing population demographics, healthcare statistics for rural areas, financial projections, and contact information for what looked like dozens of universities and government agencies. David, what exactly am I looking at here? She asked, scrolling through page after page of research. David pulled his chair closer to hers, his eyes bright with excitement. It's a proposal to turn Cedar Falls into a medical training hub for rural healthcare. Look, I've been studying the problem for months, and here's what I figured out. We're not the only small town losing our hospital. It's happening all across the country. He clicked to a new page filled with statistics. There are over 60 million people living in rural areas that don't have enough doctors or medical facilities. Medical schools want to train doctors to work in these areas, but they don't have good places to do the training. Meanwhile, we have a hospital that's about to close and a bunch of empty buildings from the plant shutdown. Dr. Chen felt her heart racing as she began to understand what David was suggesting. You want to bring medical students here? To train in Cedar Falls? Not just students, David said, clicking through more documents. Residents, nurses, physician assistants, even researchers, studying rural health problems. Think about it, Mom. We have everything they need. A hospital with real patients who need care, affordable housing now that people are moving away, and a community that would benefit from having more medical professionals. Dr. Chen was amazed by the thoroughness of David's research. He had identified specific grant programs from the federal government designed to support rural healthcare initiatives. He had contacted medical schools in 3 different states that were looking to expand their rural medicine programs. He had even researched the old Morrison Industries building and found out it could be converted into classrooms and research facilities. This is incredible work, David, she said, genuinely impressed. But how did you even know where to start with something this complex? David smiled, the same proud expression he used to get when he helped her organize medical supplies as a little boy. I've been watching you work for 9 years. I know how hospitals operate, what kind of training doctors need, and what rural communities are missing. Plus, I've been volunteering here long enough to see the problems firsthand. He clicked to another section of his proposal. Look at this. I calculated that if we could get just 50 medical students and residents training here at any given time, plus their supervisors and support staff, that would bring in over $3 million a year to the local economy. And that's not counting the research grants and federal funding for the programs. Dr. Chen shook her head in amazement. David, this is the kind of project that usually takes teams of professionals months to develop. How did you do all this research while keeping up with school? I've been working on it every night for 2 months, David admitted. I knew I had to have real numbers and real contacts before I showed it to anyone. I've already had preliminary conversations with Dr. Williams at the State Medical School and Dr. Brown at Valley University. They're both interested, but they want to see a detailed proposal and community support. Dr. Chen felt a mix of pride and concern as she looked at her son. This is brilliant, but it's also a huge undertaking. Even if the medical schools are interested, we'd need approval from the hospital board, the town council, the state health department. I know, David said. That's why I need your help. You know all these people and they respect you. If you present this with me, they'll listen. If I try to do it alone, they'll just see a teenager with big dreams. Dr. Chen spent the next hour going through David's research in detail. The more she read, the more convinced she became that his idea wasn't just brilliant, it was actually possible. David had thought through problems she wouldn't have even considered, and had found solutions that showed a deep understanding of both healthcare and economics. There's something else, David said as they reached the end of his presentation. I've been in touch with some community organizations in Philadelphia, including the church network from my birth family's neighborhood. They're interested in creating partnerships that could bring urban medical students to rural training programs and rural students to urban medical schools. It could help address healthcare shortages in both areas. Dr. Chen looked at David with new eyes. This wasn't just a smart teenager with a good idea. This was a young man who had taken his personal experiences, being adopted across racial lines, living in a rural community, watching his mother work in healthcare, and used them to see connections and solutions that no one else had thought of. When do you want to present this? She asked. The hospital board meeting is next Tuesday, David replied. Dr. Martinez said they're going to vote on whether to close the hospital permanently. If we're going to try this, it has to be now. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Dr. Chen helped David refine his presentation, adding her own insights about the practical aspects of running medical training programs. They contacted the medical schools David had been speaking with and arranged for them to participate in the presentation via video call. Dr. Chen reached out to her professional network to get letters of support from doctors who specialized in rural medicine. The night before the presentation, Dr. Chen found David in his room, staring at his notes with a worried expression. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, sitting down on the edge of his bed. "What if they think it's stupid?" David said quietly. "What if they laugh at me for thinking a 17-year-old could solve problems that adults can't figure out?" Dr. Chen put her arm around his shoulders. "David, do you remember what you told me when you were 8 years old, right after you moved in here? You said you wanted to help people like I do." David nodded. "This proposal isn't just about helping people. It's about helping an entire community survive and thrive. Whether the board approves it or not, you've already accomplished something amazing. You've shown that you can see problems differently and work toward real solutions. That's exactly the kind of thinking the world needs more of." The hospital board meeting was packed with more people than had ever attended before. Word had gotten out about David's proposal, and it seemed like half the town had shown up to see what the teenager had in mind. Dr. Chen could see familiar faces in the crowd, teachers from David's school, families they had helped over the years, business owners who were struggling to stay afloat. Dr. Martinez introduced them nervously. "Before we vote on the hospital closure, Dr. Chen and her son David have a proposal they'd like to present." David stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he opened his laptop. Dr. Chen felt her heart swell with pride as she watched him take a deep breath and begin to speak with confidence and clarity about his vision for Cedar Falls. "9 years ago, this hospital saved my life," David began. "Today I want to talk about how we can save this hospital and our whole community at the same time." For the next 30 minutes, David presented his research with the skill of someone twice his age. He explained the crisis in rural healthcare, the opportunities in medical education, and how Cedar Falls could become a model for other small towns facing similar challenges. He answered questions from board members with detailed knowledge of healthcare policy and economics that surprised everyone in the room. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Dr. Chen could see people looking at each other with expressions of amazement and hope. Then slowly, applause began to build until the entire room was clapping and cheering for the young man who had just offered them a way to save their town. The applause in that hospital board meeting room seemed to go on forever. Dr. Chen watched David's face light up with a mixture of relief and joy as people stood up to congratulate him. But she also knew that applause was just the beginning. Turning David's brilliant idea into reality would require months of hard work, patience, and probably a few miracles along the way. The first miracle came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days after the presentation, Dr. Williams from the state medical school called Dr. Chen directly. "We've been looking for a community partner for our rural medicine initiative for 2 years, he said excitedly. "David's proposal is exactly what we need. When can we start?" Within a week, representatives from 2 medical schools and the state health department were in Cedar Falls, touring the hospital and the empty Morrison Industries building. David took time off school to join these meetings, answering detailed questions about his research and sharing his vision for how the programs would work. "This young man has thought of things that took our planning committee 6 months to figure out," Dr. Brown from Valley University told Dr. Chen as they walked through the old factory space. "He's identified problems we didn't even know existed, and found solutions that could work not just here, but in dozens of other rural communities." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but once it started, the changes came quickly. The hospital board voted unanimously to support David's plan. The town council approved the conversion of the factory building into medical education facilities. Most importantly, the federal government approved a 5-year, $12 million grant to fund the rural medical training program. Dr. Chen found herself promoted to Director of Rural Medical Education, a position that had never existed before, but was created specifically for her. She would oversee the training programs while continuing to treat patients in the emergency room. It was more responsibility than she had ever imagined having, but it felt like the natural next step in a career that had already taken so many unexpected turns. David spent his senior year of high school working alongside contractors, architects, and medical school administrators to design the new training facilities. He had deferred his college acceptance for 1 year, so he could see his project through its initial phase. Dr. Chen worried that he was taking on too much responsibility, but she also recognized that this experience was teaching him things no college course ever could. The first group of medical students arrived in Cedar Falls the following September, just as David was starting his freshman year at the state medical school. The town had been transformed in ways both big and small. The old factory building now housed state-of-the-art classrooms, simulation labs, and research facilities. The hospital had been renovated and expanded, with new equipment and additional patient rooms. More importantly, the streets of Cedar Falls were alive again. Young doctors and medical students filled the coffee shops and restaurants. The grocery store extended its hours to serve the new residents. The hardware store reopened, and new businesses began moving into the empty storefronts on Main Street. The economic impact was even greater than David had projected. The medical programs brought in over $4 million in their first year, and that money flowed throughout the community. Families who had been planning to leave town decided to stay. New families moved in to take advantage of the excellent health care and the opportunities in the growing medical sector. Dr. Chen often found herself amazed at how much their lives had changed. She was now supervising medical residents, teaching classes, and speaking at conferences across the country about rural medical education. Medical journals published articles about the Cedar Falls model, and other small towns began reaching out for advice on how to replicate their success. But the most rewarding part was watching the medical students and residents learn to work in a rural setting. Many of them came from big cities and had never imagined practicing medicine in a small town. By the time they completed their training in Cedar Falls, most of them were committed to serving rural communities somewhere, helping to address the shortage of doctors in areas that needed them most. David thrived in medical school, but he returned to Cedar Falls every summer to work in the programs he had helped create. He had become something of a celebrity in the medical education world, speaking at conferences and consulting with other communities interested in similar projects. Despite all the attention, he remained the same thoughtful, caring young man Dr. Chen had raised. 3 years after the first medical students arrived, Cedar Falls received an unexpected honor. The American Medical Association named the town's rural medical training program the best in the country. The award ceremony was held at the hospital, with representatives from medical schools across the nation in attendance. David, now in his 3rd year of medical school, gave the keynote speech. Dr. Chen sat in the front row, thinking back to that scared 8-year-old boy she had first met in the emergency room so many years ago. "When I was a child, this hospital saved my life," David told the audience. "But this community did something even more important. It taught me that home isn't just a place where you live. It's a place where you contribute, where you make things better for the people around you." He paused and looked directly at Dr. Chen. "My mother taught me that being a doctor means helping people when they need it most. What I learned from this community is that sometimes helping one person can help everyone." After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, Dr. Chen found a quiet moment with David outside the hospital. The building looked completely different from the struggling facility it had been just a few years earlier, but she could still remember exactly where she had been standing the night they first met. "Do you ever regret not going away to a big university right after high school?" she asked. "You could have gone anywhere, done anything." David smiled and shook his head. "Mom, everything I needed to learn was right here. You taught me that the most important thing a doctor can do is see what others miss and then act on it. That's exactly what happened with this project." "You've accomplished something incredible," Dr. Chen said. "You've not only saved this town, but you've created a model that's helping rural communities across the country." "We've accomplished something incredible," David corrected her. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't been willing to take a chance on a scared little boy 9 years ago. And it wouldn't have worked if this community hadn't been willing to take a chance on both of us." As they stood together watching the celebration continue inside the hospital, Dr. Chen reflected on how much their lives had changed since that terrible night when she first met David. Aces, the windows of vacant units covered with plywood, For 17 years, it had been his entire world. The city transformed around them as they drove, run-down storefronts giving way to refurbished buildings, then to the gleaming skyscrapers of downtown. People in business attire hurried along the sidewalks, carrying coffee cups and briefcases. It was another world just a few miles from where Dion spent his days. "Your grandfather worked downtown," May said suddenly, gazing out the window. "Before you were born. Maintenance at the old bank building." She pointed to a limestone structure they were passing. "Used to bring me lunch sometimes. We'd sit in that little park over there." Dion looked at his grandmother with surprise. She rarely spoke of his grandfather, who had died before Dion was born. The mention felt significant somehow, as if she was connecting past to present, reminding him of where they came from. The car turned onto a wide avenue lined with the tallest buildings in the city. It slowed, then pulled up to a towering glass structure with Wilson Tech displayed in understated letters above the entrance. "Here we are," the driver announced. Coming around to open their door, Dion stepped out first, then helped May. They both stood for a moment, necks craned back, taking in the immensity of the building. "Well," May said, adjusting her old but carefully maintained coat, "let's not keep this rich man waiting." The lobby was a vast space of marble and glass, with a security desk and turnstiles guarding the elevator banks. The driver led them to a dedicated elevator, swiping a card that took them express to the top floor. "Executive level," he explained. "Mr. Wilson's assistant will meet you." When the elevator doors opened, they revealed a reception area that was larger than Dion and May's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city, making it seem like they were floating above the world. A woman with a warm smile approached them. "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, I'm Lynn, Mr. Wilson's executive assistant. He's looking forward to meeting you." She gestured to May. "Can I offer you some tea or coffee?" "Tea would be lovely," May replied, her voice betraying none of the awe Dion knew she must be feeling. Lynn led them down a hallway lined with framed photographs, not of executives or business achievements, but of medical devices being used in clinics, schools with computer labs, and community centers. "Our impact wall," Lynn explained, noticing Dion's interest. "Mr. Wilson likes to remember why we do what we do." They entered a large corner office with 2 walls of windows. Robert Wilson stood as they entered, coming around his desk to greet them. "Mrs. Taylor, it's an honor to meet you," he said, shaking May's hand. "Thank you for coming all this way." "Not so far when you send a car like that," May replied with a hint of her usual spirit. Wilson smiled. "Dion, good to see you again." They settled into a seating area away from the desk, comfortable chairs arranged around a low table where tea and coffee service waited. As Lynn poured for them, Dion noticed an older man enter quietly through a side door. "Dad," Robert said warmly. "Come join us." Dion recognized Henry Wilson immediately, though the old man looked more put together than he had that snowy night. His clothes pressed, his eyes clearer. "It's the boy," Henry said, his face lighting up with recognition. "The boy who helped me." Dion stood as Henry approached, surprised when the old man embraced him briefly. "Good to see you again, Mr. Wilson," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Better now," Henry replied, taking a seat next to May. "Some days are better than others." "I know that feeling," May said with understanding. "My mind plays tricks on me sometimes too." As they settled in with their drinks, Robert Wilson began to explain his proposal in more detail. The scholarship would cover tuition at any college Dion was accepted to, plus housing, meals, books, and a monthly stipend. For May, there would be comprehensive health care coverage and assistance with housing, either renovations to make their current apartment more comfortable and energy efficient, or help finding a better place if they preferred. In return, Robert concluded, we ask only 2 things: that Dion maintains his academic standing, and that he just considers, joining Wilson Tech after graduation. No obligation, just a good faith agreement to explore the possibility. "Why?" May asked bluntly, setting down her teacup. "Why my grandson? There must be thousands of smart kids out there." Robert glanced at his father, then back to May. "I'll be completely honest with you, Mrs. Taylor. This isn't how we usually award our scholarships. There's an application process, committees, the whole bureaucratic dance." He leaned forward. "But my father and I believe in moments of character. When Dion helped my father that night, he didn't know who Henry was. He didn't help because he thought he'd get something out of it. He helped because it was the right thing to do. Henry nodded. Reminds me of someone I knew long ago. A young man who helped me when I was at my lowest after Martha died. He looked at Dion with misty eyes. Sometimes a small kindness changes everything, Robert continued, but this isn't just sentiment. I've looked into Dion's academic record. I've spoken with his teachers. He has exactly the kind of mind we want at Wilson Tech. Creative, practical, resilient. This is as much an investment for us as it is for him. Dion, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke. If I accept this, what happens next? You finish your senior year, apply to colleges, any colleges you want. Our foundation handles the financial arrangements behind the scenes. Next summer, you'd start a paid internship here at Wilson Tech, working in whatever department interests you most. Robert smiled. And your grandmother starts receiving proper medical care immediately. May reached over and took Dion's hand. This should be your decision, child, not mine. Dion looked at his grandmother, at the woman who had raised him after his mother died, who had never complained about the extra mouth to feed on her fixed income, who had encouraged his education even when it meant less money coming in. He thought about their cold apartment, about her untreated arthritis, about the future that had always seemed so narrow and predetermined. Then he looked at Robert Wilson, the janitor's son who'd made good, at Henry Wilson, whose confused wandering on a snowy night had somehow led to this moment. I need to ask one thing, Dion said slowly. If I do this, if I accept, could some of the money go toward a headstone for my mother? She's in the city cemetery, but we could never afford a proper marker. The question hung in the air for a moment. Then Henry Wilson spoke, his voice stronger than before. Martha has the most beautiful headstone, he said. Everyone should have a place to visit their loved ones. Robert nodded. Consider it done. 6 months later, Dion stood in the newly renovated living room of the apartment he shared with his grandmother. The walls were freshly painted, the windows replaced with energy-efficient models that kept out drafts, the ancient heating system upgraded to something that actually worked. On the table lay acceptance letters from 3 universities, including State, which had the engineering program he'd set his heart on. Next to them was his badge for Wilson Tech, where he'd started interning part-time in the medical device division. May sat in a new, comfortable chair by the window, her hands, less swollen now thanks to proper medication, working steadily on a quilt. Henry's coming for dinner on Sunday, she reminded him. Says he wants to try my sweet potato pie. Dion smiled. The strange friendship between his grandmother and Henry Wilson had been an unexpected development. The old man visited at least twice a month, sometimes with his son, sometimes with his nurse. On his good days, he told stories about his late wife and his time in the army. On his bad days, he sometimes thought May was Martha, but May never corrected him, just patted his hand and poured more tea. The sound of laughter from the kitchen drew Dion's attention. His cousins were visiting. The apartment was big enough for that now, and the younger children were helping to prepare dinner under his aunt's supervision. As he moved to join them, Dion paused at the small table by the door where a framed photograph stood. His mother, smiling broadly in her nursing scrubs, arm around a 12-year-old Dion. Behind the frame was a small snapshot taken at the cemetery 3 months ago. Dion and May standing beside a simple but beautiful granite headstone. Beloved mother and daughter, it read, along with his mother's name and dates. From the cold, chance encounter on a winter night had come all of this. Warmth, opportunity, connection, and a future that stretched wide open before him. You coming, Dion? His youngest cousin called from the kitchen. We need you to reach the high shelf. Coming, he called back, touching his mother's photograph briefly before turning toward the sound of his family. Some might call it luck, he thought, but Dion preferred to think of it as his mother's final lesson come full circle. Kindness given freely is never wasted.